the evil obscenity that essences in the glasnost, opening or transparency, which gathers between Zizek and Dugin. So the tradition that comes down to us through Prussia has put a great emphasis on what we learn when we're able to make a comparison rather than simply be absorbed in some sort of captivated identity. So one of the strongest examples of this we find in the whole thinking of Leo Strauss, and one need perhaps say no more than Athens and Jerusalem. So this is the juxtaposition which presents the Hebrew Bible as against Plato. No references here made, therefore, notably, one could say, to Christianity or the Christian West, but rather as we get, when we get, here's an example of the light we get, when we look out of our self-absorbed, captivated tradition as Americans, is look at what came, but remembering that Dostoevsky was translated by, who's the first great translator of Dostoevsky? But this is like 1900, 1920, something like that. It started to get, that figure may be wrong, but it's, in any case, it's been for quite a long time that these constant garnet editions have been available in English of Dostoevsky, if that's even the correct pronunciation. But when we look at Dostoevsky, then we see this view that Plato is sort of can be classed, or let's say the ancient Greek miracle, the ancient Greeks, can be classed as one kind of god, and that each nation has a different kind of god, and that this so-called scientific god of Plato, god of knowledge, where science and knowledge are the same thing, the god where you die, symbolically, according to Plato, you realize this, you're walking down a infinite path between two stars with a silvery crown of knowledge shimmering on your brow, your lofty brow, and this is supposed to be eternal knowledge. So this is one form of what, from Dostoevsky's point of view, is one national god alongside others, rather than the true faith, rather than faith in Christ. So this, parenthetically, I'll put it this way, Dostoevsky says somewhere, or perhaps it's one of his characters, I think it's him himself, that says that if there should be a choice between truth and Christ, he would stay with Christ. So truth is something that the Russian tradition, so far as truth means Plato, and means then in the current form physics, chemistry, biology, the so-called hard sciences. The fact-value distinction in vernacular usage. So far as facts points generally towards the heavy gravity of the hard sciences, so-called. So we can see that already there's an advantage to having light thrown upon one's own absorption from the point of view of someone who wants to see these potential flaws from an outside perspective, or as it were, from a perspective outside what they came into human being as. On the other hand, remaining blind, to use Hegel's metaphor. Hegel speaks in his lectures on the philosophy of history of the emotions of a blind man who had become possessed of sight. Who had said, he all of a sudden there's something inexplicable has become before somebody who was born blind, raised blind, and had no notion of the dimension of the sense of sight. In the same way, the unfolding of universal world history is supposed to produce this sort of apocalyptic vision. So taken that way, we can see that this it's not merely a boast by Dostoevsky to say the nations have their religions, but it's as though, of course, those who received the Platonic teaching, especially as it was, according to Nietzsche's notion, popularizing the Christian form. In other words, there's something called agape. Agape is the motive force, which is analogized to ordinary love, which points towards what in the Kantian version would be the teleology of the rational being, or the rational human being. That which we were meant to be, we have a motive force which leads us towards it. This, in other words, you could see that this is in both Plato, the agathon, the good, being the thing that's being human beings are being drawn towards in all their most free actions, when nothing is extraneous is disturbing them. What they would do is pursue this aim of agathon. The same thing in Christianity is the Trinitarian God coming into unity through the connection of the breathing forth of the Holy Spirit into the flesh of the Christ, become in communication with the mysterious logos, which can't be reached, but can only be known through the analogy of the good and through perhaps the theological virtues or something along those lines. But we see that these presentations are enlarged when we can compare them to other notions and then consider how they appear in the light of some kind of discrimination. But at the same time, if we remain only within one form, we seem to gain in intensity and strength in a blind and stupid way, I suppose. So that's a consideration. Whether it's so, to go back to the beginning part, what do we see with this opening as it appears with Alexander Dugin and Slavoj Zizek? We see on the one side a picture of a traditionalist who has had a specific origin, and this origin I've already pointed to by pointing to Dostoevsky. So let's look at it this way. It's simple, but one can carry it over to many reflections for many decades. Heidegger, and not just Heidegger, but I believe it's very clear in Leo Strauss and probably in Jaspers, who's the earlier generation than Heidegger also, and probably it's permeated the Prussian university system, as understands philosophy as philosophy knowledge as the essence of the human being, And then when he speaks of the great philosophers, what he means is great on analogy with other great forms of human beings, whether it's Bismarck, whether it's tragic poet like von Kleist or so, or whatever, or whether it's a strange category like Goethe, polymath like Goethe. There's a comparison of greatness in the mode of the idea of humanism, in some sense, that the emperor gives a purple cloak to the great poet, showing that there's a communion and a rejoicing between human beings as such. From this ground, Heidegger thinks then greatness with respect to philosophers as essential greatness in the sense of these are the essential human beings. But he limits himself to saying the essential Germans. So these are the beings that have given us the most insight. Say Leibniz, for instance, simple example. The calculus, the philosophy of which basically had progressivism, the notion of that improvement in the human condition is possible, which took strong hold from after Leibniz's optimism became a philosophy. Both these two aspects of Leibnizian philosophy you can see then in the notion of which de facto got its name from the French Revolution, right and left movements, progressive, conservative movements, Gladstone or Disraeli, for instance, issues such as what should the protections of child labor be, where the conservatives said the businessman should be able to use children, and the parents of those children who have nothing better to do should be able to sign a contract to send that child to work for a longer amount of time. We should have more freedom of contract. And the people who said it's inhumane to send these children to die and be chained to the wagonettes in the mines and so on, to die of coughing and so on. I should add a saving clause and say it's not that clear that you can continue to say just simply because to us that seems like an obvious case that the same thing is happening in current politics, because current politics everybody keeps saying right and left doesn't quite fit anymore. Okay, but that being said, I was simply trying to give a example of why Heidegger thinks the philosophers are the essential human beings. But he limits himself to saying essential Germans. Whereas once you say instead of essential Germans or essential human beings, you say essential philosophers, then you relativize it where you can also say essential leaders of state, essential, Putin, for example, or essential ideologues or something, and then say, oh, Zizek is ideologue of the left, Dugin is ideologue of the right, something like that. Once you say that, then you have fallen off from this notion that there's also essential human beings that are the most, they have the genius of the agathon more than the others. They're leading more in the right direction than the others. This situation opens up, as it seems to me, just the very view of these Dugin and Zizek as essential positions is a very helpful to people that are thinking the divisions in the world today. And we can see, of course, that in a certain way there's only two divisions. There's America, the allies and subordinates of America, which constitute like 70% of world GDP, signed treaty allies, and so on and so forth. And then there's everybody else. So you can see it's a profound commercial war where no holds are barred, but there's all kinds of things that are impossible for sort of strange and technical reasons. So it's not just that somebody can exercise their will directly, but there's all kinds of fidgety devices that have to be worked out, like the early, computers before the guy that founded IBM came out with his punch card machines and all these intricate giant machines. But things that are strange in the nooks and corners come in the way, so the will can't, of this huge clock that controls all human life. And then you see this split between the blocks forming. So Russia kind of accepts China's call to be part of a group which holds back against Ursula von der Leyen and the spirit of Davos, as Emanuel Wallerstein called it. So you see these blocks form, and they're fairly, almost one could say, quartz crystal clear in their being faced off against one another in their direct and vengeful, baleful opposition to one another. Looking at this, I think we should at the same time juxtapose this to another possibility, which is a science which would stand above the Western fact value distinction, which forbids science to coming into our political activity and makes it somehow recalcitrant with respect to sensible advice. And then you have the Eastern world with the various thinkings of the Eastern world, which are less clear to myself as a Westerner. And sort of in between, you have Russia, which is only the east of the West, but not actually part of the East proper to Orthodox Christian, rather than the atheistic Catholic Christianity. Of course, within that atheistic Catholic Christianity, you find people who are actually believe in God, like the author of the theological meditations, and like Heidegger himself, I suppose. Although Heidegger, you could say, is not like Thomas, because Thomas was both philosophic and a believer, but Heidegger is more of a questioner, so you could make that intricate, subtle distinction between the faith and questioning. Questioning is, of course, more active. Faith is more like the position of prostration, radical prostration. So you have a look at the whole situation from a different point of view if you juxtapose it to what the questioner Heidegger says when he says that his position is that any problem which is essential will keep returning. So that Heidegger is not a historicist in the sense of being a relativist, but his position is more like what Plato and Aristotle held. I don't know, Aristotle didn't think there was a creation, full stop. Maybe, I'm not sure. I think Plato thought there were many creations. I'm not exactly sure about how that works, but in any case, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle in his when he talks about how weather affects communities, for instance, different policies crop up, but if they're Persian, they're too much in the sun, they become indolent, and if they're German, then supposedly they're too much in the cold, they become barbarian, savage, and only in the Goldilocks position of Athens do you then, according to the way Plato and Aristotle, the way Aristotle specifically thinks these changes in climate can have a Lebensraum effect, Friedrich Ratzel effect on people. I think this is the same way Plato and Socrates thought, okay, if there were multiple worlds kept coming up, some would be better than others, okay, but that doesn't. But they still thought that juxtaposed against eternity, where the image of perfection always existed, whereas Heidegger doesn't stipulate that there's an eternity. In fact, he says he doesn't see how one can, any more than how Kant can get out of the phenomena to the noumena, does he see how we can get out of wherever it is we are to the eternal plane. Merely designating the mathematical as the eternal doesn't is not satisfying. I don't think it's not satisfying to me. I don't think that's eternity, and you can show examples because, of course, Thomas had some ideas about the two right angles would always equal the full sum of the angles of any possible triangle, but then we came out with these mathematics, supposed Euclidean mathematics, which showed there's different ways where you can construct a triangle where that doesn't hold, and likewise with binary maths where 1 plus 1 is 0, or other forms of math which change the 1 plus 1 being 1 while remaining consistent and rational. So Heidegger deepens the position of Socrates and Plato with respect to how open it is to doubt by challenging the principle of identity and the laws of thought in Aristotle, the laws that are been called metaphysics first principles. But at the same time, he still says the essential problems will, as it were, reoccur, and this leaves open the possibility that they could be solved. So in the light of that Heideggerian notion of how scientific research should understand itself, sort of the Kayum or heaven or sky it's under, we can juxtapose this current situation where there's blocks represented by Zizek and blocks represented by Dugin, which have very specific views of what knowledge is and how we should be comporting ourselves, acting, what it's all about, and what we should be doing. They have totally different views.